Welcome to Idlewild Cottage, a quiet place where kindred spirits can linger together over a cup of tea, savoring all things lovely and cozy. My name is Juliana, and I'm delighted to have you. Each episode here at the cottage will center around a theme. That theme will be celebrated in a number of ways, through literature, art, nature, and even some favorite movie scenes. We'll cherish the sweet and simple things of life. So make yourself at home, and I'll put the kettle on. It was November, the month of crimson sunsets, parting birds, deep, sad hymns of the sea, passionate wind songs in the pines. Lucy Maud Montgomery's pen brings each month to life like no other. Now, this month does mean the wrapping up of the fall content here at Idlewild Cottage. We'll share together in one more episode next week and then break until the winter season arrives. For now, as we step cozily into November, we'll continue to take our cues from Maud in the form of Anne Shirley. Following our beloved heroine through several November scenes, we'll discover that, true to form, she has a knack for seeking out beauty wherever she goes. Even as a young teen, we see that Anne is just as content to sit cozily by the fire on a wild November night as she is to explore misty haunts and hollows out of doors. Indeed, these excerpts from Anne of Green Gables reveal her delight in both. It was nearly dark, for the full November twilight had fallen around Green Gables, and the only light in the kitchen came from the dancing red flames in the stove. Anne was curled up on the hearthrug, gazing into that joyous glow where the sunshine of 100 summers was being distilled from the maple cordwood. She had been reading, but her book had slipped to the floor, and now she was dreaming with a smile on her parted lips. "Anne," said Marilla, "Miss Stacy was here this afternoon when you were out with Diana." Anne came back from her other world with a start and a sigh. "Was she? Oh, I'm so sorry I wasn't in. Diana and I were over in the haunted wood. It's lovely in the woods now. All the little wood things, the ferns and the satin leaves and the crackerberries, have gone to sleep, just as if somebody had tucked them away until spring under a blanket of leaves. I think it was a little gray fairy with a rainbow scarf that came tiptoeing along the last moonlight night and did it." A couple of years slip by, and we find that Anne is now a 16-year-old teacher at the Avonlea school. Though she has grown, her flights of fancy are just as vivid and endearing as ever. Anne, walking home from school through the birch path one November afternoon, felt convinced afresh that life was a very wonderful thing. "What a nice month this November has been," said Anne, who had never quite got over her childish habit of talking to herself. November is usually such a disagreeable month, as if the year had suddenly found out that she was growing old and could do nothing but weep and fret over it. This year is growing old gracefully, just like a stately old lady who knows she can be charming even with gray hair and wrinkles. We've had lovely days and delicious twilights. How quiet the woods are today, not a murmur except that soft wind purring in the treetops. How dear the woods are. You beautiful trees, I love every one of you as a friend." Anne paused to throw her arm about a slim young birch and kiss its cream-white trunk. Before we step away from Anne of Avonlea, I'd like to take a detour over to the journals of Lucy Maud Montgomery. I enjoy unearthing snippets of thought or activity that would eventually find their way into Maud's stories. If you listened in last week, you may recall Philippa Gordon from Anne of the Island referring to the Pickwick Papers. It always made her hungry. Well, this is drawn directly, almost word for word, from a 1905 journal entry of Maud's. She wrote, "I remember that it was a book that always made me hungry. There was so much good eating in it, and the folks were always celebrating with ham and eggs and milk punch. I generally went on a cupboard rummage after I had been reading Pickwick." Well, similarly, Maud's impressions of November resembling an old lady find their roots on a dismal entry of November 14th, 1904. What a fit of bad temper the world has indulged in. Day before yesterday she was not unbeautiful, a dignified old dame in fitting garb of brown and ermine. Yesterday she tried to ape juvenility, putting on all the airs and graces of spring with warm sunshine and blue hazes. And what a bedraggled, uncomely old hag she was, all tatters and wrinkles. She grew angry then at her own ugliness and has raged all night and all day. It is in Anne's years at Redmond that we begin to feel some of the angst Maud associates with November. Indeed, in Anne of the Island, we sense the yearning for beauty, the line which opened our episode, yet we also feel a fair amount of angst and consternation when Anne bumps into a young man in the park who is not Gilbert Blythe. It was November, the month of crimson sunsets, parting birds, deep, sad hymns of the sea, passionate wind songs in the pines. Anne roamed through the pineland alleys in the park, and as she said, let that great sweeping wind blow the fogs out of her soul. Anne was not wont to be troubled with soul fog, but somehow, since her return to Redmond for this 3rd year, life had not mirrored her spirit back to her with its old, perfect, sparkling clearness. As Anne roams the park, wrestling with soul fog, we read on. Suddenly the rain came with a swish and a rush. Anne hurried down the slope. As she turned out on the harbor road, a savage gust of wind tore along it. And then there came a voice close to her. "Pardon me, may I offer you the shelter of my umbrella?" Well, you can hear more about this scene in episode 9, Under the Umbrella. I'll just close this Anne moment with the shift in her November-y outlook. The rain came steadily down for the best part of an hour, but the time seemed really very short. When the clouds parted and a burst of pale November sunshine fell athwart the harbor and the pines, Anne and her companion walked home together. By the time 22-year-old Anne settles into life at Windy Poplars as the principal of Summerside High, she is much more settled in matters of the heart, though she is still as fanciful as ever. Here we find her tucked away in her room. Anne, sitting at her tower window one late November evening, with her pen at her lip and dreams in her eyes, looked out on a twilight world and suddenly thought she would like a walk to the old graveyard. She had never visited it yet, preferring the birch and maple grove or the harbor road for her evening rambles. But there is always a November space after the leaves have fallen when she felt it was almost indecent to intrude on the woods, for their glory terrestrial had departed, and their glory celestial of spirit and purity and whiteness had not yet come upon them. So Anne betook herself to the graveyard instead. We pick up a few pages later. Anne went down to the old graveyard along a deep rutted lane between high mossy stone dikes tasseled with frosted fern. Slim pointed Lombardies, from which November winds had not yet stripped all the leaves, grew along it at intervals, coming out darkly against the amethyst of the far hills. But the old graveyard, with half its tombstones leaning at a drunken slant, was surrounded by a 4-square row of tall, somber fir trees. It is in this setting that Anne unexpectedly meets Miss Valentine. "I'm glad I happened here this evening," said Miss Valentine. I can tell you all about everybody buried here." Well, Miss Valentine does so for the rest of the chapter, and on leaving the graveyard, we read, "At the graveyard gate, Anne turned and looked back. A strange, peaceful hush lay over the windless land. Long fingers of moonlight were beginning to pierce the darkling firs, touching a gravestone here and there and making strange shadows among them. But the graveyard wasn't a sad place after all. Really, the people in it seemed alive after Miss Valentine's tales." The fourth book in the series, Anne's House of Dreams, finds Anne settling into a new home and new life in Four Winds Harbor. The proximity to the sea means that Novembers are especially mysterious and mournful. This locale also paves the way for Anne and Gilbert to connect with another weaver of tales, Captain Jim. The splendor of color which had glowed for weeks along the shores of Four Winds Harbor had faded out into the soft gray blue of late autumnal hills. There came many days when fields and shores were dim with misty rain or shivering before the breath of a melancholy sea wind. "In November I sometimes feel as if spring could never come again," sighed Anne. Well, the Blythes' wise panacea for the November blues, or grays, as it were, is found in community. Anne and Gilbert spent many an autumn evening at the lighthouse. It was always a cheery place. Even when the east wind sang in minor and the sea was dead and gray, hints of sunshine seemed to be lurking all about it. Occasionally, while Gilbert and Captain Jim, keeper of the lighthouse, are pondering all kinds of problems before the fire, Anne and kindred spirit Leslie respond to the lure of the wild. Sometimes Leslie went to the lighthouse with them, and she and Anne wandered along the shore in the eerie twilight, or sat on the rocks below the lighthouse until the darkness drove them back to the cheer of the driftwood fire. Then Captain Jim would brew them tea and tell them tales of land and sea and whatsoever might betide the great forgotten world outside. A side note, here Maud is quoting Longfellow's poem, The Hanging of the Crane, revealing her own and Anne's love of literature. The women display that knack for quoting the classics which older generations of students committed to memory throughout their school years. Anne is a mother in her mid-30s when we step into the pages of Anne of Ingleside, the final selection in our November wanderings. And how fitting it is to end with the cozy Blythe home and Anne's ever-cheerful outlook on the world about her. November closed in on Ingleside. The dark hills, with the darker spruces marching over them, looked grim on early falling nights, but Ingleside bloomed with firelight and laughter, though the winds came in from the Atlantic, singing of mournful things. But some days even the wind blew cheerfully through the silvery gray maplewood, and some days there was no wind at all, only mellow Indian summer sunshine and the quiet shadows of the bare trees all over the lawn and frosty stillness at sunset. "Look at that white evening star over the Lombardy in the corner," said Anne. "Whenever I see anything like that, I am minded just to be glad I am alive." Like Anne, would we look around us this month? And would that looking inspire in us the gratitude of Psalm 95? Let us come before the Lord with thanksgiving, for in His hands are the depths of the earth, and the mountain peaks belong to Him. The sea is His, for He made it, and His hands formed the dry land. Thank you for joining me today, dear ones. Please come again soon to Idlewild Cottage.